The wedding bells had not even finished ringing when the screaming started. Elena stood frozen at the edge of the village square, her white dress catching the wind, her hand still warm from where Henry had been holding it only seconds before. One moment he was laughing, lifting her hand to kiss it in front of everyone who had gathered to watch them become husband and wife. The next moment, the ground shook under the weight of horses, and the golden banners of King Alaric filled the narrow street, like a wave nobody had time to escape. The villagers dropped to their knees out of habit, heads bowed, hearts pounding. Elena did not kneel. She could not move at all. Her eyes were fixed on Henry, who had straightened his back the moment the royal guards rode in, his jaw tightening the way it always did when he felt cornered. Henry had never liked authority. He had grown up watching his father lose everything to unfair taxes, watching his mother cry over debts that were never truly theirs. So when one of the king's guards shoved an old man aside to clear the road, Henry stepped forward. "There is no need to push him," Henry said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "We are simple people. Show a little respect." It was such a small thing to say, a sentence any decent man might say without thinking twice. But the guard's hand went to his sword, and the crowd gasped, and somewhere behind the line of horses, a voice called out for quiet. King Alaric rode forward. He was younger than the stories made him sound, with sharp eyes that seemed to measure everything they landed on. He looked at Henry, the way a man looks at an unexpected obstacle in his path, something to be assessed and then removed. Elena would remember that look for the rest of her life, because it held no anger, no cruelty, only a terrible kind of calm. "You raised your voice against my guard," Alaric said. His tone was flat, almost bored, as if this were a conversation he had already had 100 times before. "On a day when I am simply passing through your village. I meant no disrespect to you, my king," Henry said, and Elena could hear the fear creeping into his voice now, the fear he was trying so hard to hide. "Only kindness toward an old man." "Kindness," Alaric repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. A groom, defending strangers, on his wedding day. How noble. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. She wanted to step forward, to explain, to beg, but her legs would not carry her. Later she would hate herself for that stillness, for the seconds she lost simply standing there in shock while the moment slipped away from her. "Take him," Alaric said, and turned his horse as though the matter were already finished, already forgotten. What happened next happened too fast for the village to fully understand until it was over. There was a struggle, a cry from Henry that cut off too suddenly, and then silence. A silence so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could hear the wind moving through the wedding flowers scattered on the ground. She did not remember running toward him. She only remembered kneeling in the dirt with her wedding dress soaking up something dark, holding Henry's face in her hands, saying his name over and over, as though repetition alone could bring him back. The crowd was silent. Even the horses seemed to hold still. When Elena finally lifted her head, her vision blurred with tears, she looked directly at the king. She did not think about what it might cost her. She did not think about anything, except the ache tearing through her chest. "You took him from me," she said, her voice shaking, but clear enough for the whole square to hear. "On the one day, I was supposed to keep him forever. May every happiness you ever try to hold slip through your fingers the way mine just did." A curse spoken to a king's face, in front of his own guards, was not something anyone survived. Elena knew this. Some part of her, the part not consumed by grief, expected the sword to fall on her next, and in that moment, she almost welcomed it. But Alaric did not move for a long moment. He studied her, this small woman kneeling in blood and white lace, unafraid of a man everyone else in the kingdom feared. Something shifted behind his eyes, something none of his guards had ever seen before. "Bring her with us," he said finally. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elena's own mother cried out, reaching for her. But the guards were already moving, already lifting Elena to her feet despite her struggling. "No," Elena said, twisting against the hands holding her. "No, let me go. Let me bury him, please." "She stays under my protection," Alaric said, cutting through her pleas without raising his voice. "Whatever punishment she deserves, I will decide it myself. Not here, not like this." Protection. The word sounded like a cruel joke to Elena. She did not want protection from the man who had just taken everything from her. She wanted her life back, the small, quiet life she had built with Henry since they were children playing in the same fields. The life that had a wedding morning and was supposed to have decades more mornings after it. The journey to the palace passed in a blur. Elena sat in a covered carriage, still in her ruined wedding dress, staring at nothing while the world rattled past outside the window. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody explained anything. She simply existed in a state of numb disbelief, waiting for the moment reality would catch up to her and break her completely. When they arrived, the palace rose up before her like something from a story told to frightened children, tall and cold and impossibly grand. Servants rushed to attend to the king's arrival, but Elena was led away quietly, brought to a small chamber with a soft bed and a warm fire, the kind of room that felt entirely wrong for a prisoner. "You are not a prisoner," the woman assigned to her, a kind-faced servant named Margaret, told her gently that first night. "The king has ordered that you be treated as a guest." "A guest does not get dragged from her own wedding," Elena said, her voice hoarse from crying. "A guest is not kept somewhere she never asked to be." Margaret did not argue with her. She simply set down a tray of food Elena had no appetite for and left her alone with her grief. Elena did not sleep that night, or the night after. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over, wondering what she could have done differently. If she had pulled Henry back sooner, if she had spoken instead of him, if she had simply kept her curse behind her teeth and let herself be forgotten in some quiet corner of the kingdom, instead of drawing the king's attention, like a spark drawing flame. Word spread quickly through the palace about the strange village woman the king had brought back with him. Servants whispered in the halls, wondering what use a grieving peasant bride could possibly be, to a man who had never once, in all his years on the throne, shown interest in anyone beyond his advisors and his duties. Some said it was guilt weighing on him. Others said something darker, that the king had taken a liking to the fire in her eyes even as she cursed him, and that no good would come of it for the woman forced to live under his roof. Elena heard none of this gossip directly, wrapped as she was in her own sorrow, but she felt its weight in the way people looked at her when she was finally allowed to walk the palace gardens. Curious, wary, pitying. Days passed like this, slow and gray, each one blending into the next. Elena refused every invitation to dine with the king, refused every offer of new clothes to replace her ruined dress, refused anything that might suggest she was settling into this life she had never chosen. She wanted the king to see her grief every single day, to be reminded of what he had done, because forgetting felt like the ultimate betrayal of Henry's memory. But grief, no matter how fiercely held, cannot stop the world from turning, and Elena's world was about to shift again, in a way she could not yet imagine. Because in the quiet nights before the wedding that never happened, before the horses and the banners and the terrible calm in a king's eyes, Elena and Henry had shared one last night together, as two people simply in love, unaware that it would be their only chance. She did not know it yet, standing at her window and staring out over gardens she had never asked to see, but a small part of Henry was still with her, and that small part would soon change everything. For her, for the king, and for a kingdom that had no idea what was coming. The sickness began quietly, the way most life-changing things do, disguised as something ordinary. Elena woke one morning with her stomach turning, the smell of bread from the kitchens below suddenly unbearable. She told herself it was grief, that sorrow could make a body sick in strange ways, and for a while she believed it. Margaret was the one who noticed first. She had cared for enough young women in the village before coming to serve at the palace to recognize the signs, the paleness, the way Elena flinched from certain smells, the exhaustion that pulled at her even after a full night's rest. "Elena," Margaret said one afternoon, setting down a cup of tea Elena had barely touched, "when was the last time your courses came?" Elena opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. She counted back the weeks in her mind, and the answer settled over her like ice water. "It cannot be," she whispered, more to herself than to Margaret. "It cannot be." But it was. A healer was summoned quietly, under Margaret's careful discretion, and within days, the truth was confirmed. Elena was carrying a child. Henry's child. For a moment, sitting alone in her chamber after the healer left, Elena felt something she had not felt since the wedding day. A flicker of joy, small and fragile, threading through her grief like a single ray of sunlight, breaking through storm clouds. A piece of Henry was still here. Still growing inside her, she was not entirely alone. But the joy did not last long before fear crept in behind it. She was an unmarried woman, living under the king's roof, carrying the child of a man the king himself had ordered killed. She did not know what such a discovery might mean for her, or for the innocent life growing inside her. Would the king see the child as a threat, a reminder of the man he had wronged? Would he see it as an inconvenience to be dealt with quietly, the way inconvenient things sometimes were in places of great power? Elena decided, in that quiet moment, that no one else could know. Not yet. Not until she understood what kind of danger she might be inviting, by simply existing in this palace, with new life growing inside her. She begged Margaret to keep the secret, and the older woman, moved by the desperation in Elena's eyes, agreed. For weeks, Elena wore looser clothing, ate carefully to hide her sickness, and avoided anyone who might look too closely. She grew skilled at excuses, at turning conversations away from herself, at disappearing into corners of the palace, where few people thought to look. It could not last forever, of course. Nothing built on secrecy inside a palace full of watchful eyes ever does. It was one of the healers assigned to check on Elena's general health, a stern woman named Beatrice, who answered directly to the king's counsel, who finally noticed what Margaret had noticed weeks before. Beatrice did not ask Elena's permission before examining her more closely, and within moments, the truth that Elena had guarded so carefully was laid bare. "You are with child," Beatrice said, her voice giving away nothing of what she might be thinking. Elena's hands trembled in her lap. "Please," she said, "please, do not tell the king. I will leave the palace. I will go anywhere. I will disappear. Only please, do not tell him." But Beatrice had already made up her mind about her duty, long before Elena finished speaking. "This is not something I can hide from him," she said, not unkindly, but firmly. "The king has a right to know what happens under his own roof." Elena spent the following days in a state of quiet terror, waiting for the summons she knew would come. She imagined 100 different outcomes, each worse than the last. Perhaps she would be sent away in disgrace. Perhaps the child would be taken from her the moment it was born. Perhaps the king, in his cold and calculating way, would decide that a peasant woman carrying a dead traitor's child was simply too much trouble to keep around at all. When the summons finally came, it arrived not as a formal order, but as a quiet request, delivered by Margaret with worried eyes. The king wished to see Elena in his private study, alone. Elena walked through the palace halls that evening, feeling as though she were walking toward her own execution. Every step echoed too loudly. Every servant she passed seemed to look at her with either pity or curiosity, as if they already knew what she did not. The study was smaller than she expected, warmer too, lit by a fire that crackled softly in the corner. Alaric stood near the window, his back to her when she entered, his hands clasped behind him, in a posture she had come to recognize, even in the short time she had lived under his roof. He always stood like a man carrying the weight of decisions no one else could see. "You sent for me," Elena said, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. Alaric turned to face her. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply studied her, the way he had studied her that first day in the village square, as though trying to read something written beneath her skin. "Beatrice tells me you are carrying a child," he said finally. His voice was quiet, careful, none of the cold command she remembered from that terrible morning. Elena lifted her chin, refusing to look away even though every instinct told her to shrink back. "Yes," she said, "Henry's child." Something flickered across his face at the mention of Henry's name, something Elena could not quite read. Guilt, perhaps, or simply discomfort at being reminded of what he had done. "And you hid this from me," he said. It was not quite an accusation, more an observation. "Would you have reacted kindly to the news?" Elena shot back, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "You killed the father in front of me. Forgive me for not trusting you with what remains of him." She expected anger at her boldness. She had learned quickly that few people spoke to the king this way and lived to speak to him again, but Alaric only sighed, running a hand over his face, in a gesture so human, so tired, that Elena almost forgot for a moment who she was speaking to. "I have thought a great deal about that day," he said quietly. "More than you might believe." Elena said nothing, waiting, unsure what he meant by it. There are things about your Henry that you do not know, Alaric continued, his eyes meeting hers directly now. Things that made that day far more complicated than a simple act of cruelty. What are you talking about? Elena asked, a chill settling over her despite the warmth of the fire. Alaric hesitated, as though weighing how much truth she could bear alongside everything else she had already lost. Not tonight, he said finally. Tonight, we speak only of the child. Elena wanted to press him, to demand answers immediately, but something in his expression told her this was not a door that would open through force. She swallowed her questions, for now, and waited. The child changes things, Alaric said, pacing slowly toward the fire. You understand this, I hope. A child born to an unmarried woman under my roof, fathered by a man executed for defiance against the crown, will not be seen kindly by this court. There will be those who call the child cursed, those who use it against you, and against me, the moment it is convenient for them. Then let me leave, Elena said quickly. Let me raise my child far from here, away from your court and its cruelty. I never asked to be brought to this palace in the first place. And go where? Alaric asked, turning to face her again. Back to a village that watched its king kill a man on his wedding day? Do you believe they will welcome you back with open arms, carrying a child that reminds them daily of what happened? Or will they see you as a curse upon their doorstep, the woman who brought a king's fury down on their peaceful lives? Elena's throat tightened. She had not considered this, had not let herself think that far ahead, focused only on escaping the palace that had become her prison. There is another option, Alaric said, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant in a way Elena had never heard from him before. One I have considered carefully these past days. What option? Elena asked, dread coiling in her stomach. Alaric held her gaze steadily. Marry me. The words hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible. Elena actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that held no humor in it at all. You cannot be serious, she said. You killed the man I was supposed to marry. You dragged me from my own wedding day. And now you ask me to become your wife? I ask you to protect your child, Alaric said, unmoved by her disbelief. If you marry me, the child is legitimized. No one in this court, no matter how much they whisper, can question its place or its safety. You would be queen. Your child would be protected by every law and tradition this kingdom holds sacred. And what would you gain from this? Elena asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Kings do not offer their crown out of kindness. What is truly in this for you? For the first time since she had known him, Alaric looked almost uncertain, as though the answer to her question was one he had not fully worked out himself. Perhaps, he said slowly, I simply do not wish to see harm come to a woman and a child who have already suffered enough because of decisions made in this palace. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for the lie she was certain must be hiding somewhere in his words. But she found none, only a strange, quiet sincerity that unsettled her more than any cruelty could have. I need time, she said finally. I cannot answer something like this in a single evening. Take the time you need, Alaric said, inclining his head. But do not take too long. The court moves quickly once it senses weakness, and I would not have either of you become its next target. Elena left the study that night with her mind spinning, torn between grief for Henry and the terrifying, impossible offer now sitting heavy in her chest. She did not sleep again that night, staring instead at the small, barely visible curve beginning to show beneath her nightgown, wondering what kind of world she was bringing this child into, and whether marrying the man who had taken its father's life could ever truly be called protection. 3 days passed before Elena found the courage to return to the king's study. In that time, she barely ate, barely slept, walking the palace gardens at odd hours, simply to keep her thoughts from consuming her whole. Margaret watched her with growing concern, but said little, sensing that this was a decision Elena needed to reach on her own. On the 4th morning, Elena requested an audience with the king. She was led again to the same small study, the same fire crackling softly in the corner, and found Alaric seated this time at his desk, papers spread before him that he set aside the moment she entered. You said there were things I did not know about Henry, Elena said, before he could speak, before her nerve could fail her. I want to know them, all of them, before I give you any answer at all. Alaric studied her for a long moment, then gestured for her to sit. Elena remained standing, arms crossed protectively over the small curve of her stomach, unwilling to give him the comfort of her ease. "Very well," he said finally, rising from his desk and moving toward the window. "What I am about to tell you does not leave this room." "Not yet. There are still pieces of this that are dangerous to speak of openly." Elena said nothing, only waited, her heart pounding against her ribs. "3 months before your wedding day," Alaric began, "my spies uncovered a plot forming within my own court. A noble house, one that has resented my family's rule for generations, had begun reaching beyond the palace walls, searching for allies among the villages and towns who might be persuaded to rise against the crown when the moment came." Elena frowned, confused. "What does this have to do with Henry?" "Your Henry," Alaric said, choosing his words carefully, "was not simply a young man defending an old villager that day. He had already been in contact with agents of House Vasilis for weeks before your wedding. They promised him coin, promised his family relief from the debts that had haunted them for years, in exchange for information about the movements of my guards through your region, and for his willingness to help stir unrest among the villagers when the time was right." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her, though she had not moved at all. "That cannot be true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Henry would never—" "I understand this is difficult to hear," Alaric said, not unkindly. "But my spies had already confirmed his correspondence with House Vasilis before that day. When my guard pushed the old man aside, it was not carelessness. It was a test, designed by my own council, to see whether Henry would react as their informants suggested he might, exposing his loyalties before witnesses." "So you knew," Elena said, anger flooding through her grief now. "You knew what would happen to him before you even arrived in my village. You planned it." "I did not plan his death," Alaric said, and for the first time, something like genuine regret crossed his features. "I intended to have him arrested quietly, questioned, given the chance to explain himself, and perhaps redeem his involvement by revealing what House Vasilis truly intended. His outburst in front of the crowd, in front of my guards, forced my hand faster, and more publicly than I wanted. My guard captain acted before I could stop him, believing Henry's defiance confirmed everything the informants had claimed." Elena sank slowly into the chair she had refused only moments before, her legs no longer able to hold her steady. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that Henry was going to betray his own people, that he was going to help a noble house rise against you, in exchange for money to solve his family's debts." "I am telling you what my spies uncovered," Alaric said gently. "I cannot know what was truly in his heart when he made those choices. Perhaps he was desperate. Perhaps he believed he was protecting his family the only way he knew how. Desperation makes people do things they might never otherwise consider." Elena pressed her hands against her face, trying to reconcile this new, terrible truth with the man she had loved since childhood, the man who had held her hand and promised her forever, only moments before losing everything. Had she truly not known him at all, or had circumstances simply pushed him toward choices she could never have imagined? "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked finally, lifting her head to meet his eyes. "Why not before? Why let me believe you had murdered an innocent man for no reason?" "Because the truth is dangerous," Alaric said. "House Vasilis does not yet know how much I discovered about their plot. If word spreads that Henry's death was connected to treason rather than a simple act of royal cruelty, they will know their network has been compromised, and they will move against me faster than I am prepared to counter. I needed time, and I needed to know I could trust you with a truth this heavy before I placed it in your hands." Elena sat in silence for a long moment, turning everything over in her mind. Grief still lived in her chest, that had not changed, but it had shifted shape now, tangled up with confusion, and a strange, aching sympathy for the desperate choices Henry might have made, without her ever knowing. "And if House Vasilis learns their plot with Henry failed," Elena said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn on her, "what will they do next?" "They will look for other opportunities," Alaric said grimly. "And an unmarried, unprotected woman carrying the child of the very man they attempted to recruit is exactly the kind of loose thread a house like theirs would love to pull. They could claim you as evidence of my cruelty, use your grief as a weapon against my rule, or worse, attempt to silence you and the child entirely, before either of you can reveal what you know." Elena's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, a protective gesture she had not even realized she was making. "Then I am already a target," she whispered, "whether I marry you or not." "Yes," Alaric said simply. "But married to me, you carry the full protection of the crown. Unmarried, you carry nothing but the whispers of a court that has already decided what story to believe about you." Elena closed her eyes, exhaustion pressing down on her from every direction. She thought of Henry, of the boy she had grown up loving, of the desperate man he might have become under pressures she never fully understood. She thought of the tiny life growing inside her, innocent of every complicated truth surrounding its origins. And she thought of herself, alone in a world that had already proven itself far more dangerous and far more complicated than the quiet village life she once expected to live. "If I agree to this," she said finally, opening her eyes, "I want conditions." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of Alaric's mouth, though it vanished quickly. "Name them." "I will not pretend to love you," Elena said firmly. "Not for the court, not for anyone. This marriage exists to protect my child, nothing more. You will not expect anything beyond that from me." "Agreed," Alaric said without hesitation. "And when the truth about House Vasilis and their plot against you can finally be told," Elena continued, "I want to be the one who decides how much of Henry's involvement becomes known. He was still the father of my child. I will not have his memory dragged through the mud simply to serve your political needs." Alaric considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Agreed, so long as the truth does not endanger the kingdom in the telling." Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her like a heavy cloak. "Then I accept," she said quietly. "I will marry you." The wedding, when it came only a week later, bore no resemblance to the celebration Elena had once imagined for herself. There were no wildflowers gathered by village children, no laughter echoing through familiar streets, no mother crying happy tears at the sight of her daughter in white. Instead, Elena stood in a grand chapel filled with unfamiliar nobles, their faces carefully arranged into polite interest that did not quite hide their curiosity and judgment. She wore a gown far finer than anything she had ever imagined owning, deep blue silk stitched with silver thread that caught the candlelight as she walked down the long aisle alone. No father to give her away, no friends to witness this strange turn her life had taken. Margaret stood near the back of the chapel, the only familiar face in the entire room, offering Elena a small, encouraging nod as she passed. Alaric waited for her at the altar, dressed in formal robes that made him look every bit the king the whole kingdom feared and respected. And yet something in his eyes softened slightly as she approached, as though even he could not quite believe how quickly circumstances had brought them to this moment. The ceremony passed in a blur of unfamiliar words and rituals, promises exchanged that felt hollow to Elena even as she spoke them, knowing they were born not from love, but from necessity, from the desperate need to protect a child who had not yet even taken its first breath. When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, a quiet ripple of applause moved through the gathered nobles, polite and restrained, nothing like the joyful celebration Elena had once dreamed of. As they turned to face the court together, Elena caught sight of a woman standing near the front of the gathered nobles, her expression unlike any of the others in the room. Where most faces held simple curiosity, this woman's held something sharper, something calculating, her pale eyes fixed on Elena, with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck rise. "Who is that?" Elena whispered to Alaric as they made their way down the aisle together, nodding politely at the assembled nobles on either side. Alaric followed her gaze, and something tightened almost imperceptibly in his jaw. "Lady Seraphine Vasilis," he said quietly. "Watch her carefully, Elena. She has wanted this crown for herself for a very long time, and she will not welcome you standing in her way." Elena felt a chill move through her despite the warmth of the chapel, understanding with sudden clarity that her wedding day, however different from the one she had once dreamed of, had not brought an end to danger. It had only marked the beginning of an entirely new kind of battle, one she would need every bit of her strength and wit to survive. Life as queen was nothing like Elena had imagined it might be, back when the word queen belonged only to stories told to children before bed. There was no leisure in it, no endless days of comfort and ease. Every morning began with lessons she had never asked for, court etiquette, the histories of noble families she would need to recognize by name and face, the delicate art of speaking carefully enough that her words could never be twisted into a weapon against her, or the crown. Margaret remained close by her side through it all, promoted now to Elena's personal attendant, a small comfort in a world that otherwise felt entirely unfamiliar. Elena leaned on her more than she liked to admit, grateful for one honest voice among so many careful, guarded ones. The nightmares came often in those early weeks. Elena would wake in the dark hours before dawn, heart pounding, Henry's name caught in her throat, the memory of that terrible morning, replaying itself with cruel precision behind her closed eyes. Sometimes she dreamed of him as she had known him, laughing and warm. Other times, new and unwelcome images crept in. Henry meeting secretly with strangers in the dark. Henry counting coins that were never meant to be his. Henry choosing coin over the life he had promised to build with her. She never knew, waking from these dreams, which version of him to grieve. Alaric kept a respectful distance in those first weeks, true to the promise he had made in his study. He did not seek her out beyond what royal duties required, did not press her for conversation or company beyond formal appearances at court functions, where their presence together was politically necessary. Elena told herself this distance was a relief, that it was exactly what she wanted from a marriage built on necessity rather than affection. But some nights, sitting alone in her grand chamber, with only the crackling fire for company, the distance felt more like loneliness than relief. It was during one such evening, weeks into her new life as queen, that Elena first crossed paths properly with Lady Seraphine Vasilis. Elena had wandered into one of the smaller palace libraries, seeking a quiet corner away from the constant watchful eyes of the court, when she found Seraphine already there, seated near the window with a book open on her lap that she did not appear to actually be reading. "Your Majesty," Seraphine said, rising gracefully, and offering a bow so perfectly measured it managed to feel like an insult rather than a courtesy. "I did not expect to find you wandering the palace alone. Surely a queen in your delicate condition should have attendants close at hand." Elena forced herself to remain composed, remembering Alaric's warning from her wedding day. I think more clearly in quiet spaces," Elena said carefully. "Perhaps you understand that need yourself." Seraphine's smile did not reach her pale eyes. "Of course, though I imagine there is much for you to think about these days. It cannot be easy, adjusting to a life so far removed from where you began." The words were polite on their surface, but Elena heard the barb hidden beneath them clearly enough. "I have found the palace welcoming in its own way," Elena replied evenly, refusing to give Seraphine the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "How fortunate," Seraphine said, moving closer, her gaze drifting deliberately to the small, now more visible curve of Elena's stomach. "Though I do wonder, Your Majesty, how the court will receive a child conceived before the wedding, fathered by a man executed for treason against the crown. Children are so impressionable, are they not? I only hope the truth of its origins does not follow it through life like a shadow." Elena's blood ran cold at the mention of treason, a word she had been so careful to keep hidden from public knowledge. "I am not sure what you mean," Elena said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage, despite the alarm rising in her chest. "My first husband was a village man, nothing more." Seraphine's smile sharpened slightly, and Elena understood in that moment that the woman was testing her, searching for cracks in her composure to determine exactly how much Elena might actually know. "Of course," Seraphine said smoothly. "Forgive me. Grief can make even the clearest memories feel uncertain. I only meant to offer my sympathies, Your Majesty. Court can be such an unforgiving place for those unprepared for its games." Elena excused herself as gracefully as she could manage, her heart hammering against her ribs as she made her way back toward her chambers. She found Alaric that same evening, interrupting whatever quiet work occupied him in his study, unable to wait until morning to share what had happened. "She knows something," Elena said, pacing in front of his desk while he watched her with careful attention. "Or she suspects enough to be dangerous. She mentioned treason, Alaric. She was testing me, trying to see how much I understood." Alaric's expression grew grim as he listened. "Seraphine has always been cunning," he said. "It would not surprise me if she has suspected House Vasilis's own exposure for some time now, watching carefully for any sign that their plot with Henry has unraveled." "What do we do?" Elena asked, sinking into the chair across from him, exhaustion pulling at her despite the fear still coursing through her. "For now, nothing changes," Alaric said. "We continue as planned, gathering the remaining evidence against House Vasilis quietly, until we have enough to move against them decisively. without giving them time to prepare a counterattack. In the meantime, you must be careful, Elena. Seraphine will look for any weakness, any moment of vulnerability, to use against you. Elena nodded slowly, though the weight of constant vigilance felt exhausting to carry alongside everything else already pressing down on her. And if she spreads rumors before we are ready to act? She asked. What then? Then we manage them as they come, Alaric said, though something in his voice suggested even he was not entirely certain how well they could manage a threat as patient and calculating as Seraphine Vasilis. The rumors began not long after, exactly as Elena had feared. Whispers moved through the court like smoke, impossible to trace back to any single source, yet somehow reaching every corner of the palace within days. Some said the queen had bewitched the king with dark magic learned from her village, explaining his sudden and uncharacteristic decision to marry a peasant woman he barely knew. Others whispered that the child she carried was not entirely human, cursed by whatever desperate magic she had used to secure her place on the throne. The cruelest rumors suggested that Elena had planned her first husband's outburst deliberately, orchestrating his death to secure her own path toward the crown. Elena heard these whispers everywhere she went, in the careful way servants lowered their eyes when she passed, in the sudden silence that fell over groups of nobles whenever she entered a room. She tried her best to hold her head high, to move through the palace with the same quiet dignity she had promised herself she would maintain, but the constant weight of suspicion and judgment wore at her more than she liked to admit. Ignore them, Margaret told her one evening, brushing out Elena's hair with gentle, practiced hands. Cruel words said behind closed doors cannot hurt you unless you let them. It is easy to say ignore them, Elena replied, watching her own tired reflection in the mirror. Harder to actually do it, when every whisper feels like another stone thrown at a wall already close to breaking. Margaret's hands paused for a moment. You are stronger than you believe, Elena, she said quietly. I have watched you survive things this past month that would have broken many others entirely. Do not let Seraphine's poison convince you otherwise. Elena held on to those words in the difficult weeks that followed, even as her pregnancy advanced and her body grew heavier, even as court functions became increasingly exhausting to endure under the weight of watchful, judgmental eyes. She began, slowly, to notice small kindnesses amid the cruelty, servants who offered genuine warm smiles, a handful of nobles who treated her with real respect rather than careful political courtesy. She also began, though she hated to admit it even to herself, to notice Alaric differently. He had kept his promised distance faithfully, yet small moments revealed cracks in that careful boundary. He appeared unexpectedly one evening when Elena struggled to sleep, finding her in the palace gardens staring up at the stars, and simply sat beside her in silence rather than insisting she return indoors. He noticed, without her ever mentioning it, that she preferred certain foods over others as her pregnancy progressed, quietly ensuring the kitchens adjusted her meals accordingly. He defended her once, sharply and without hesitation, when an elderly noble made a thinly veiled comment about the appropriateness of a peasant sitting at the queen's table. These small moments confused Elena more than the grand gestures of any court celebration could have. She had entered this marriage prepared for coldness, for a purely political arrangement, devoid of any real warmth. She had not prepared herself for a king who watched her with quiet concern, when he believed she was not looking, who seemed genuinely troubled by the cruelty of a court he ruled, but could not fully control. You are staring again, Alaric said one evening, catching her watching him across the dinner table, where they now shared meals with increasing regularity, though always alone, away from the judgmental eyes of the court. Elena flushed and looked quickly down at her plate. I was simply thinking, she said, flustered in a way that surprised even herself. About what? Alaric asked, genuine curiosity coloring his voice. About how little I understood you, that first day in the village square, Elena admitted slowly. I believed you were nothing more than cruelty wearing a crown. I am no longer certain that belief was entirely fair. Something shifted in Alaric's expression, something warmer than Elena had seen from him before. I have made mistakes, he said quietly. Henry's death weighs on me more than you likely realize, regardless of the treason that led to that moment. I did not want that outcome, whatever else is true. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of dishonesty in his words, and finding none. Thank you, she said finally, for telling me that. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, something neither of them had expected to find in a marriage built entirely on necessity. Outside the walls of the palace, danger continued gathering quietly in the shadows, Seraphine and House Vasilis growing bolder with each passing week. But within those walls, something unexpected had begun to grow alongside the child Elena carried, something neither she nor Alaric had planned for, and something that would soon be tested far more severely than either of them yet understood. The royal hunt had been Alaric's idea, a rare chance to escape the suffocating formality of the palace for a single afternoon, and though Elena's advancing pregnancy meant she would not ride, she agreed readily to join the gathered party as an observer, eager for any excuse to breathe air that did not smell of polished stone and careful diplomacy. The forest surrounding the royal hunting grounds stretched wide and golden under the autumn sun, and for the first time in months, Elena felt something close to peace settle over her as she watched from a cushioned carriage positioned at a safe distance from the main hunting party. Margaret sat beside her, pointing out birds overhead, and for a brief, precious hour, Elena allowed herself to simply enjoy the beauty of the day, without the weight of court politics pressing down on her shoulders. The peace shattered without warning. A commotion erupted near the tree line, shouts rising sharply among the hunting party, horses rearing in sudden panic. Elena's carriage driver, startled by the chaos, lost control of the reins for a critical moment, and the carriage lurched violently to one side as the horses bolted, dragging it toward a steep ravine that dropped away just beyond the tree line. Elena grabbed for Margaret, her heart pounding with terror as the carriage tilted dangerously, wood groaning under the strain, wheels skidding against loose earth that threatened to give way entirely beneath them. She heard Margaret scream, heard her own voice crying out, one hand instinctively wrapping protectively around her stomach, as though she could shield her unborn child through will alone. Then, impossibly, strong arms were pulling her free, hauling her out of the tilting carriage, just as it finally lost its battle with gravity, tumbling down into the ravine below, in a crash of splintering wood. Elena found herself pressed against Alaric's chest, his heart hammering as fiercely as her own, his arms locked around her as though he could not bring himself to let go even now that the immediate danger had passed. "Margaret!" Elena gasped, twisting to search for her attendant, relief flooding through her when she saw two guards had pulled the older woman clear as well, shaken but unharmed. "You are safe," Alaric said, his voice rough with an emotion Elena had never heard from him before, something raw and unguarded that cut straight through the careful composure he always maintained. "You are safe, Elena. I have you." It was only later, once the immediate chaos had settled, and Elena sat wrapped in blankets near a hastily built fire, while healers checked her over carefully, that the true danger of what had happened became clear. One of the guard captains approached Alaric with grim news, his expression tight with barely controlled fury. "The horses did not simply panic, Your Majesty," the captain said quietly, though not quietly enough to escape Elena's hearing entirely. "We found this lodged near the carriage wheel." He held out a small, sharpened blade fashioned specifically to wedge into a wheel's spokes, designed to snap under pressure and send a carriage careening out of control. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as understanding settled over her. "This was deliberate," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Alaric said, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger, the calm mask he wore so carefully around the court entirely absent now. "Someone intended for that carriage to crash, Elena. Someone intended for you, and our child, to be badly hurt or worse." Elena's hand trembled where it rested against her stomach. "Seraphine," she said quietly. "We cannot prove it yet," Alaric said, though the fury in his voice suggested he had already reached the same conclusion. "But I intend to find proof, whatever it takes." The journey back to the palace passed in tense silence, guards positioned closely around Elena's new carriage, Alaric refusing to leave her side even for a moment. Elena watched him throughout the ride, noticing things she had perhaps chosen not to notice before, the way his hand never fully released hers, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for any further sign of danger, the way genuine fear had lived behind his eyes when he pulled her from that collapsing carriage. This was not the behavior of a man fulfilling a political arrangement out of duty alone. "You were afraid," Elena said quietly, once they were finally settled back within the safety of the palace walls, alone together in his study once more. "Truly afraid." not simply concerned for the political consequences of losing an heir. Alaric turned from the window where he had been staring out at the darkening sky, his expression unusually open, unguarded in a way Elena had rarely seen from him. Yes, he admitted quietly. I was afraid, Elena. More afraid than I have been in a very long time. Why? Elena asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, had perhaps suspected it for weeks now without allowing herself to fully acknowledge it. Alaric crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that Elena could see the sincerity written plainly across his features. Because somewhere between that terrible day in your village and this moment, he said quietly, you stopped being simply an obligation I felt compelled to protect. I care for you, Elena. Far more than I ever intended to. Far more than either of us planned for when we made our arrangement. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Part of her wanted to retreat immediately behind the careful walls she had built since Henry's death. Walls meant to protect her from exactly this kind of vulnerability. But another part of her, a part that had been growing steadily over these past months of small kindnesses and quiet understanding, recognized the truth in his words because she felt it too. I did not want to feel this way, Elena admitted softly. I told myself I could not, that it would somehow betray Henry's memory to care for the man who ordered his death, however complicated the truth behind that death turned out to be. And now? Alaric asked, searching her face carefully. Now, Elena said slowly, I am no longer certain that caring for you and honoring Henry's memory have to remain separate things. Neither of them spoke further about it that night, the weight of the assassination attempt and everything it revealed pressing too heavily to allow for anything more than that quiet, honest acknowledgement. But something had shifted permanently between them, a barrier finally lowered that neither had fully intended to lower, and Elena found herself, for the first time since arriving at the palace, looking toward the future with something other than dread. The investigation into the assassination attempt moved quickly in the days that followed. Alaric's most trusted guard captain, a sharp-eyed man named Edmund who had served the crown faithfully for over a decade, led the effort personally, questioning stable hands and carriage attendants with careful precision, until a trail of evidence began to emerge. The blade found lodged in the carriage wheel had been forged by a blacksmith with known ties to House Vasilis, a connection Edmund confirmed through careful, discreet questioning. More damning still, a stable hand finally confessed, after considerable persuasion, that he had been paid handsomely by an unknown intermediary to ensure Elena's carriage was positioned near the ravine during the hunt, and that the horses had been deliberately spooked at a signal given from the tree line. It traces back to House Vasilis, Edmund reported to Alaric and Elena together, spreading the gathered evidence across the study desk. Though Lady Seraphine has been careful, as always, to keep her own hands clean of direct involvement, everything points toward her influence, yet nothing proves it definitively enough to move against her openly. Elena studied the evidence carefully, her mind working through everything Edmund had gathered. There has to be something more, she said slowly. Something connecting all of this together more directly. Alaric mentioned Henry's involvement with House Vasilis months ago. Perhaps there is a connection there we have not yet fully explored. What do you mean? Alaric asked, watching her carefully. You said Henry was approached by agents of House Vasilis, Elena said, her mind racing now as pieces began falling into place. But who approached him directly? Perhaps if we can trace that connection, we can find the proof linking Seraphine to everything, both Henry's recruitment and this attempt on my life. Edmund exchanged a glance with Alaric before nodding slowly. It is possible, he said. I will look into the original informant reports more carefully. It took another 2 weeks of careful, quiet investigation before Edmund returned with the answer Elena had been searching for, a discovery that changed everything Elena believed she understood about Henry's final weeks. The agent who first approached Henry in your village, Edmund said grimly, laying out a final piece of evidence before them, a letter recovered through careful means from House Vasilis' own private correspondence, was working under direct orders from Lady Seraphine herself. She identified Henry specifically, knowing of his family's debts, knowing of his frustration with the crown's taxation. She did not simply recruit an already willing traitor, Your Majesty. She manufactured one, deliberately targeting a desperate young man and offering him exactly what he needed to hear to secure his cooperation. Elena felt something break loose inside her chest as she absorbed this new truth, a complicated mixture of relief and fresh grief tangling together. Henry had not simply chosen betrayal freely. He had been carefully, deliberately manipulated by a woman skilled in exploiting exactly the kind of desperation that had haunted his family for years. She used him, Elena said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. She saw a struggling young man and turned his love for his family into a weapon against the crown, knowing full well it might cost him his life in the process. Yes, Alaric said grimly. And when her plot with Henry ended in his death, rather than the useful chaos she intended, she pivoted her efforts toward you instead, first through rumors, and now through direct attempts on your life, likely fearing you might eventually uncover exactly this connection. Elena rose from her chair slowly, a new resolve settling over her despite the grief still tangled through her chest. Then we have what we need, she said firmly. Enough proof to finally move against her, and enough truth to finally understand what truly happened to Henry. Alaric studied her for a long moment, something like pride mixing with the concern still evident in his expression. Are you certain you are ready for what comes next? He asked. Confronting Seraphine publicly will not be simple, Elena. She will not surrender easily, and she may still have allies within the court willing to protect her interests. Elena met his gaze steadily, her hand resting protectively against the now significant curve of her stomach. I have already lost Henry to her manipulation, she said. I will not lose anything else to her cruelty. Not my child, not you, and not the life I am finally beginning to build in this palace. Whatever comes next, Alaric, I am ready to face it standing beside you. Alaric reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with a gentleness that spoke volumes beyond any words he might have offered. Then we face it together, he said quietly, as we should have from the very beginning. Together, they began planning carefully for the confrontation that would finally bring House Vasilis's treachery into the light, gathering their remaining evidence, securing the loyalty of trusted allies within the court, and preparing for a battle that would determine not only Elena's safety, but the very stability of the kingdom Alaric had sworn to protect. The Great Hall had never felt so full of tension as it did on the morning Alaric called every noble family to gather before the throne. Word had spread quickly through the palace that something significant was about to happen, and by the time Elena took her place beside Alaric, seated carefully in a chair positioned close to his throne given how far along her pregnancy had progressed, the hall was packed with anxious, whispering faces. Lady Seraphine stood near the front of the gathered nobles, dressed elegantly as always, her composure giving nothing away, though Elena noticed the slight tightness around her eyes, the careful way she avoided looking directly toward the throne. Alaric rose slowly, his presence commanding immediate silence throughout the hall. 3 months ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room, an attempt was made on the life of your queen, and by extension, the life of the heir she carries. I have spent these past months gathering proof of who was truly responsible. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, nobles exchanging uneasy glances. Seraphine's expression remained carefully neutral, though Elena, watching closely, saw her hands tighten almost imperceptibly at her sides. The evidence gathered by my guard captain, Alaric continued, gesturing toward Edmund, who stepped forward carrying the collected proof, traces the weapon used to sabotage the Queen's carriage directly to a blacksmith with known ties to House Vasilis. Further investigation revealed a stable hand paid to ensure the Queen's carriage was positioned for exactly the kind of accident that nearly claimed her life. This is outrageous, Seraphine said sharply, stepping forward despite the murmurs rising around her. You accuse my house based on the word of a bribed stable hand? Surely, Your Majesty, you require more substantial proof before making such serious accusations before the entire court. I have more, Alaric said calmly, nodding again toward Edmund, who produced the recovered letter, the one connecting Seraphine directly to Henry's recruitment months before Elena's wedding day. This letter, recovered from your own house's private correspondence, proves that you personally identified and targeted a desperate young villager, manipulating him with promises of coin to help destabilize the crown's authority. When that plot resulted in his execution, rather than the chaos you intended, you turned your efforts towards silencing the woman, who might one day uncover the truth of your involvement. The color drained visibly from Seraphine's face as the letter was read aloud for the entire court to hear, her careful composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of evidence she could no longer easily dismiss. Lies, she said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Fabrications designed to remove a rival house from favor. The blacksmith has already confirmed his connection to your household under careful questioning, Edmund said firmly, as has the stable hand, and as does the handwriting in this letter, which matches samples already on file with your house's official correspondence to the crown. Elena watched Seraphine's face carefully, as the truth continued unraveling before the entire court. Watched the moment realization finally settled over the assembled nobles that their carefully cultivated image of Lady Seraphine Vasilis had been nothing more than a mask concealing genuine treachery. Elena rose slowly from her chair, drawing every eye in the hall toward her. Her heart pounded, but her voice remained steady when she finally spoke. "You used Henry," she said, addressing Seraphine directly, for the first time since the confrontation began. A young man desperate to protect his family from deaths that were never truly his fault. You saw his desperation and turned it into a weapon, knowing full well it might cost him everything. And when your plot failed, you tried to silence me too, and the innocent child I carry, simply to protect your own ambitions. The hall fell utterly silent, every noble watching the queen's quiet, controlled fury with something close to awe. "I loved him," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Whatever choices he made in his final weeks, however desperate or misguided, he did not deserve to become a pawn in your ambitions, and I will not allow you to make me, or my child, your next casualty." Seraphine's composure finally shattered entirely under the weight of Elena's words and the mounting evidence surrounding her. "You do not understand what it means to watch a lesser house rise while your own family's rightful influence fades," she snapped, her carefully cultivated elegance giving way to raw, bitter fury. "I did what was necessary to secure my family's place in this kingdom's future." "You confess, then," Alaric said quietly, his voice cutting through her outburst with quiet authority, "to orchestrating Henry's recruitment, and to the attempt on the queen's life." Seraphine's mouth pressed into a thin line, understanding too late that her own anger had just provided the final confirmation the court needed. Several guards moved forward at Alaric's subtle signal, positioning themselves around her. "Lady Seraphine Vasilis," Alaric announced formally, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority across the silent hall. "You are hereby stripped of your title, and all lands belonging to House Vasilis. You will be escorted from this kingdom under guard, forbidden from ever returning to these borders under penalty of severe consequence. Your family's remaining members will be permitted to retain their lesser holdings, provided they demonstrate no further loyalty to your treasonous ambitions." Seraphine was led from the hall in stunned silence, her carefully built power crumbling entirely in the span of a single morning. The gathered nobles watched her departure with a mixture of shock and quiet satisfaction, whispers already beginning about the queen's quiet courage in facing down such a dangerous enemy so directly. Elena felt the tension finally drain from her shoulders as the hall slowly began to empty, nobles offering respectful bows toward her that felt, for the first time since her arrival at the palace, genuinely sincere rather than merely obligatory. "You did well," Alaric said quietly, once they were finally alone again, his hand finding hers gently. "More than well. You faced her with more courage than I have seen from seasoned diplomats twice your age." "I did it for Henry," Elena said softly. "And for our child, and for myself, finally, after months of feeling like nothing more than a pawn in everyone else's games." "You were never a pawn," Alaric said firmly, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "You have been the strongest presence in this palace since the day you arrived, Elena. I only wish I had recognized it sooner." The weeks that followed brought a kind of peace Elena had not experienced since before her wedding day shattered so completely. With House Vasilis's threat finally neutralized, the whispers throughout the court began to shift, curiosity and judgment, slowly giving way to genuine respect for the queen, who had faced down treachery with such quiet determination. Elena's pregnancy reached its final weeks during this period of relative calm, and though nervousness about the birth itself lingered constantly beneath the surface of her days, she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, looking forward to the future rather than simply surviving each day as it came. The birth, when it finally arrived on a cold morning in early winter, proved long and difficult, filling the palace halls with an anxious tension that even Alaric's usual composure could not fully mask. He remained close by throughout the entire ordeal, pacing outside Elena's chamber, despite Margaret's gentle insistence that such matters were traditionally left to the women attending the birth. When the healer finally emerged, exhausted but smiling, to announce that both mother and child had come through safely, Alaric moved into the chamber so quickly he nearly knocked over a startled attendant in his haste. Elena lay propped against soft pillows, exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced, but her face lit with a joy that outshone every hardship of the past months, as she looked down at the small, healthy child now resting in her arms. "A daughter," Margaret said softly, standing nearby with tears of happiness in her eyes. "Healthy and strong, Your Majesty." Alaric approached slowly, almost hesitantly, as though afraid the moment might shatter if he moved too quickly. Elena looked up at him, exhaustion and joy mingling together in her expression, and carefully offered him their daughter to hold for the first time. "She is beautiful," Alaric said softly, his voice thick with an emotion Elena had never heard from him before, cradling the small child with a gentleness that seemed to surprise even himself. "Truly beautiful, Elena. What shall we name her?" Elena asked quietly, watching the way his entire demeanor had softened, the powerful king transformed in this quiet moment into simply a father meeting his child for the first time. Alaric considered this carefully, still gazing down at the small face studying him with wide, curious eyes. "Something strong," he said finally. "Something that honors both the courage of her mother and the difficult path that brought her safely into this world." They settled eventually on the name Aurora, meaning dawn, a name Elena felt captured perfectly the way their daughter's arrival had brought a new beginning, after so much darkness and difficulty. The formal presentation ceremony, held several weeks later once Elena had recovered sufficiently from the birth, brought the entire court together once more, though this gathering held none of the tension that had marked their earlier confrontation with Seraphine. Instead, the great hall filled with genuine celebration as Alaric presented their daughter formally before the assembled nobles, publicly and proudly claiming her as his own heir, silencing forever any lingering rumors about her legitimacy or origins. Elena stood beside him throughout the ceremony, holding little Aurora carefully, watching the nobles who had once whispered cruel judgments about her now offering genuine warmth and respect toward their queen and her child. The transformation felt almost unbelievable when she considered how far she had traveled since that terrible morning in her village, when her entire world had shattered in the span of a single moment. That evening, once the formal celebrations had finally concluded and the palace had settled into quiet nighttime stillness, Elena found herself standing once more at the window of her chamber, Aurora sleeping peacefully in her arms, looking out over the same gardens that had once felt like nothing more than the walls of an unwanted prison. Alaric joined her quietly, wrapping his arms gently around both of them, and for a long moment, they simply stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars scattered across the dark winter sky. "I never imagined my life would lead here," Elena said softly, breaking the silence at last. "When I think of that morning, of everything I lost and everything I never expected to find afterward, it still feels impossible sometimes." "Do you regret it?" Alaric asked quietly. "Any part of the path that brought you to this moment?" Elena considered this carefully, thinking of Henry, of the grief that still lived quietly in some corner of her heart even now, tangled together with understanding and a strange, complicated forgiveness for the desperate choices he had made. She thought of the fear and uncertainty of those early weeks in the palace, the cruel whispers of a court that had once judged her so harshly, the danger that had nearly cost her everything during that terrible afternoon in the forest. "I regret the pain that brought me here," she said finally, turning to meet Alaric's eyes in the soft moonlight. "But I do not regret where I finally arrived. Not you, not Aurora, not the life we have built together, despite everything that tried to stop us." Alaric smiled, genuine and warm, pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead as Aurora stirred softly in her sleep between them. "Then let us build something even greater from here," he said quietly, "together, as we always should have from the beginning." Outside, the winter stars continued their slow, patient turn across the sky, indifferent to the struggles and triumphs of the small kingdom below. But within the palace walls, a family stood together in quiet, hard-won peace. A queen once broken by grief, now standing strong beside the king she had once believed she could only ever hate, their daughter sleeping soundly between them, safe at last, from every danger that had once threatened to tear their fragile new world apart. 2 years passed before the past reached out for them one final time. Aurora had grown into a bright, curious child, quick to laugh and quicker still to chase after the palace hounds through the gardens Elena had once wandered alone in grief. Elena had settled fully into her role as queen by then, respected by a court that had long since abandoned its early cruelty, trusted by advisors who once dismissed her as nothing more than a peasant thrust unwillingly into royal life. She had even begun quietly funding relief for villages burdened by unfair debts, the very kind of hardship that had once pushed Henry toward desperation, determined that no other family should face the same impossible choices. It was Edmund who brought the warning, arriving at the palace late one evening, with dust still clinging to his travel cloak, and urgency written across his face. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing quickly before Alaric in the throne room, Elena standing close beside him, as she always did now during matters of importance. "We have uncovered a small group of Vasilis loyalists, former household guards who escaped punishment after Lady Seraphine's exile. They have been gathering quietly in the eastern hills, and our informants suggest they intend one final act of vengeance before scattering entirely." "Against whom?" Alaric asked sharply, though something in his tightened jaw suggested he already feared the answer. "The princess," Edmund said grimly. "They believe striking at the heir will wound the crown more deeply than any attempt on the king or queen ever could." Elena's hand went instinctively toward the doorway where Aurora had been playing only moments before, fear sharp and immediate cutting through the peace of recent years. "Where is she now?" she asked, already moving. "Safe, with Margaret, under guard," Edmund assured her quickly. "But I would not risk assuming that safety will hold for long. These men are desperate and have little left to lose." Alaric moved quickly, summoning his most trusted guards and issuing orders with the same calm authority Elena remembered from that very first day in her village, though this time she stood beside him rather than trembling before him, a full partner in the decisions that would protect their family. "We do not wait for them to strike first," Alaric said firmly. "We move against them immediately, before they have the chance to reach anywhere near the palace grounds." Elena insisted on accompanying the effort as far as safety allowed, refusing to simply wait helplessly within palace walls, while Aurora's safety hung in the balance. She rode alongside a contingent of guards toward the eastern hills, her heart pounding, with a fear more intense than anything she had experienced since that terrible afternoon in the forest years before. The confrontation, when it finally came, unfolded swiftly. Alaric's guards, well-trained and vastly outnumbering the small band of desperate loyalists, surrounded the group's hidden camp before they could organize any real attempt at their planned attack. Edmund led the effort personally, and within hours, the remaining threat from House Vasilis had been fully neutralized, the loyalists captured and brought before the crown to answer for their intentions. Elena stood beside Alaric as the captured men were led away under heavy guard, relief washing through her so completely her knees nearly buckled beneath her. "It is over," Alaric said quietly, pulling her close. "Truly over this time, Elena. Whatever remained of Seraphine's ambitions has finally been extinguished." Elena allowed herself, finally, to breathe fully for what felt like the first time in years. The last shadow of the past, finally releasing its grip on the family she had built against every impossible odd stacked against her. In the months that followed, Elena made a decision she had considered for a long time, but never quite found the courage to act upon. She asked Alaric to accompany her back to her home village, the same quiet streets where her wedding day had once shattered so completely, where Henry still rested in the small cemetery behind the village chapel. The village had changed little in the years since Elena had left it, though the people who greeted their queen's unexpected arrival did so with a warmth that surprised her. Memories of that terrible day softened somewhat by the relief funds Elena had quietly sent toward their community over the years, and by the story that had eventually spread of the treason Henry had been drawn into, offering the village a more complete understanding of a day that had once seemed like nothing more than senseless cruelty. Elena knelt beside Henry's grave, with Aurora's small hand held gently in her own, Alaric standing respectfully a short distance away, allowing her the private moment she needed. "I forgive you," Elena whispered quietly, tears gathering in her eyes as she touched the simple stone marking his resting place. "For whatever desperation led you toward choices that cost you everything. I understand now, more than I ever thought I could, how fear can push people toward decisions they never truly wanted to make." She glanced back toward Aurora, who watched her with quiet, curious eyes too young yet to fully understand the weight of the moment, and toward Alaric, waiting patiently nearby, with the same quiet steadiness that had carried them both through every hardship since that terrible wedding day. "You would be proud of her," Elena continued softly, brushing gentle fingers over Aurora's dark hair. "She has your laugh, Henry. I hear it sometimes, and it brings me back to simpler days, before everything became so complicated." She rose slowly, taking one last look at the grave before turning back toward her family waiting nearby. Alaric met her gaze with quiet understanding, offering his hand as she approached, and together, they walked back through the village streets that had once witnessed the worst day of Elena's life, now filled instead with the quiet, hopeful presence of a family that had survived against every impossible odds. The kingdom continued to flourish in the years that followed, its people slowly forgetting the fear that had once surrounded whispers of House Vasilis, remembering instead the story of a queen who had faced tragedy, treachery, and danger with unwavering courage, and a king who had learned, through her example, to rule not merely through calculated authority, but through genuine care for the people depending on him. Elena often thought back, in quiet moments, to that terrible morning when her entire world had shattered in an instant. When grief had consumed her so completely, she could not imagine any future beyond the darkness pressing in around her. She could not have known then, kneeling in the dirt of her ruined wedding day, that the very man responsible for her deepest pain would one day become her greatest partner, that the child she carried through so much uncertainty would grow into a bright, laughing symbol of everything she had survived and built despite it all. Life, Elena had come to understand, rarely followed the paths people expected it to take. Sometimes the deepest tragedies carried within them the seeds of unexpected strength, and sometimes the people least expected to offer comfort became the very foundation upon which an entirely new life could be built. Standing now in the palace gardens she had once walked alone in grief, watching Aurora chase after butterflies while Alaric looked on with quiet, contented pride, Elena finally allowed herself to fully embrace the peace she had fought so hard to find. The past would always remain a part of her story, its grief and its lessons woven permanently into who she had become. But her future, bright and full of promise, belonged entirely to the family she had built from the wreckage of tragedy, a family stronger and more resilient than anything the darkest days of her past could ever have predicted.